Again, welcome. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. It's amazing that it's not snow, sleet, or ice. It could very well be possible. I would ask you, please silence your cell phones as a courtesy to our speaker and to everyone else on the listen. Thank you. Today, as you no doubt read, our presenter is Dr. Hart Hodges, who's Associate Professor of Economics at Western Washington University. He also serves as Director of the University's Center for Economic and Business Research. His research interests include health economics, local economic development, which we'll hear about today, and natural resource and environmental economics. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Hodges has served as the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Economist for the U.S. Department of the Interior, worked as a financial analyst for the city of Portland, Oregon, held several positions in the private sector, and was a research associate at World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. Locally, Hart has served on volunteer committees such as the City of Bellingham's Budget Advisory Committee and Affordable Housing Task Force. He also is currently on the board of Women Care Shelter. Dr. Hodges received his PhD in economics from the University of Washington, his master's in environmental management from Duke University, and his BA from Williams College. His presentation today is entitled Local Economic Development, From Slogans to Substance. Please join me in welcoming Hart Hodges.
Try to get out of here.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
Hart's over there.
Thank you, Don.
Be careful, I guess.
Back here just a little bit. I've got basically 3 goals today. And a little clicker that doesn't work. And one fear. The 3 goals really are, first, trying to explain very quickly some popular. Okay. If I talk this loud, can you hear me in the back? No. All right. Okay. I'll fade in and out on you. Explain some economic development strategies that are popular in a lot of areas, and then share some data related to those strategies. And my hope is that you'll either say, "Huh, I hadn't thought about it that way," or at least start asking some questions on your own. Well, that's not long recording. Thanks, Skip. The second goal is to get you to think about the local economy a little differently than you might already think about it. And to do that, I'm going to share some slides about to show the results of some survey work that we did. And I'll give more of an introduction on who the we is, and then finally, well, let me back up. In showing the slides about the survey work, I really want you to start thinking about the local economy differently, because I think we've, for quite a while, made distinctions between local businesses and not local businesses, small businesses and large businesses, and whatever. And a lot of those distinctions I don't think are very important. I think we ought to be celebrating any business. I'll explain that. And finally, I want to share some trends in the broader economy that makes you think, if nothing else, your time was worthwhile for more than just the food today. So I hope you walk out feeling like you learned something or got a new perspective. But my fear is, I have a tendency to think anything that I see is plainly obvious to anybody else. And I start talking very fast, and especially because some of you have seen half these slides before, I run the risk of going off on too many tangents and trying things on the fly to make it interesting. So I hope I can stay on task or on topic, and I hope my computer will work. So the state of Washington requires, under their Skills for the Next Washington program, that each jurisdiction, especially workforce development areas, and for us that's Whatcom, Skagit Island, and San Juan County, but to some extent also the economic development councils, focus on strategic clusters. In other words, we're supposed to identify the areas where we already have a relative strength in employment. Food manufacturing might be one. Healthcare might be one. And focus there. State guidelines. We have strong programs in economic gardening, and I've put up just a teeny definition to some extent. Can you read those in the back? To some extent. And the idea of focusing on local businesses is certainly growing in popularity, not just here. All right, so here's a few statistics, quotes. Top one says, small firms accounted for 65% of the 15 million net new jobs created between 1993 and 2009. That's from the Small Business Administration. And then I'm trying to be sort of politically neutral, so I pick on George Bush and Bill Clinton with two quotes, also talking about the importance of small business. And so there's this push to focus on small, think about the importance of small businesses, and I think that's pretty understandable. The idea of buying local. So this is a graphic from Yes Magazine, making 2 points. One, reminding us that money spent locally tends to stay in the local economy, getting multiplied, increasing the economic impact. And then off to the side is a study talking about the importance of local food. And if we buy more local food, we don't ship food as far, and those savings also help the environment. Okay, we can go on and on. I want to back up because I want us as a community to do better. And the focus on growing local businesses, sort of the economic gardening idea, in part is a response to the limited success in smokestack chasing, if you will. Right. If you think about it just for a second, the math doesn't work. How many hundred companies are there out there that we might attract? But there's also thousands of other counties and thousands again as many communities chasing those companies. So that's not a very high probability or high likelihood of success approach to economic development, and a lot of people are recognizing that fact. So that there's some understandable sort of foundations to economic gardening. I think the desire to encourage high-tech, green, whatever types of jobs we're imagining is understandable. We want low-impact jobs. We want high-wage jobs. All sorts of stories there. And especially when we go through the survey, demonstrating a respect for place and the environment is understandable, but it's a great big but. I want us to think differently than these sort of simple ideas and for all intent and purposes, slogans. Think about developing a cluster for a moment. We have a waterfront to be redeveloped. How about a biotech cluster down in the waterfront? Hope somebody's giggling. Okay. All right. The idea of being able to develop a cluster assumes several things. One, that you can pick ahead of time the sectors that are going to be strong, say 10, 20 years from now. Good luck. Also about being first. Something about being first, because not everybody gets to have that biotech cluster. Whoever's first may win. People that are second, third, fourth, fifth, and any slower, not so good. Right. And there's a new idea about clusters that are not necessarily based on industries, but they're based on, say, knowledge workers or the creative class, if you're reading Richard Florida's work. But this idea of being first plays the same as there, right? If you get the artists, that means somebody else doesn't get them. So you've got to think very carefully about this strategy and how likely we can succeed, and especially with policy. More on that in a moment. Economic gardening also assumes something about being able to identify in the data those firms that are poised for growth and being able to give them the information that they need to succeed. And a couple of us in the room, I don't know how many times we've gone to a business and said, yeah, we're with the government, we're here to help. And the response the response is often, thanks, but if I wanted to grow my business, I wouldn't be in Whatcom County. I'm here for a lifestyle reason, not growth, and so on and so forth, so there's some tension there. And finally, there's a great big gap, if you will, between academic economists and practitioners of economic development. And the academic economists tend to look at data and bigger picture issues. And one of the things that we find over and over is that the chance of picking winners like that is really small. And if you look at how many efforts there have been to start industrial parks, research parks next to colleges, so on and so forth, and what those things have actually given a community, makes you ask, what could we have done with that money instead? All right, so here's a graphic that's supposed to look messy. It shows net job gains and losses by size of firms. And I know it's hard to see the graphic from the back. The three lines represent three different sizes of firms. Firms with less than 100 workers, firms with less than 500 workers, and firms with more than 500. So big firms, little firms, and really little firms, if you will. And the fact that the lines cross frequently illustrates the sort of folly in saying small firms create most jobs. Sure they do, sometime, in some places, and it also depends on how you define small. In fact, the literature on small business and the importance of small business, which is now 30 or 40 years old, came about because there was a concern that policymakers in charge of broad issues, trade, inflation, and other factors, were forgetting about the effects of their policies on smaller businesses, where small was defined as 500 workers or less, or in some cases 1,000 workers or less. And the idea was just that half the economy, if you will, was small businesses, where small is not the micro businesses that we think about at the local level. And we've taken that literature and made it into something that it was never meant to be. And I'm just trying to remind you with this graph, this recession in particular, small businesses are lagging as they come out of it. Most of the job growth has been with large businesses, with 1,000 employees or more. So right now, large businesses are creating most jobs. So it comes and goes. And that's my first hint, that I don't think we should be making big distinctions between small and little or other. There's also an emerging literature that uses the expression borrowed size. There's a lot of small firms that depend critically on a particular big firm or what a big firm in a community has to offer. There's lots of big firms that also grow and change with small subsidiaries, spin-offs, and the like. And we ought to be thinking about the interdependence between small firms and big firms, not differences between the two, or certainly not trying to say one's better or more important than the other. I'm going to pick on the notion of going local because we encourage customers all the time to buy local. And I actually wrote with a colleague at Western a piece, John Stark's here over the side so I get to pick on him, that the Herald would not print. We submitted it on April 1st, and it was a tongue-in-cheek piece proposing that a requirement that all firms had to sell local. Because selling local is the flip side of buying local, and it was just to try to get you to think carefully about that. And so another colleague has a sort of a fun time getting people to think differently. Add some numbers to it. Think about a small farm. You might make, as the slide suggests, a 5% return on your capital. In your mind, make it 10%. I don't really care. You want a return of $20,000? $400,000 in capital? What size farm would you need? And what percentage of your customers could be local? And it just starts to make you think, well, how am I going to make this economy function? What do I really need for it? What do I want to celebrate? What do I want to advertise? And the part about keeping money in an economy longer and a bit larger multiplier because I spend my money locally, it's true. But that's an awfully narrow view. So my sort of attempt at poking fun of that is I could run around town throwing bricks through store windows. I would be creating jobs. If you take such a narrow view, you can come up with most and support any conclusion you want. We've got to think a little bit more carefully And more critically, as an example on the local food idea, yes, buying local food can reduce the transportation and reduce the impacts associated with that transportation. But be careful. All right, there was a study, Weber and Matthews found that most of the environmental impacts, and they were looking at greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of food, occur on the farm, on the production side. Only 11% of the greenhouse gas emissions can be tied to transportation. The rest are through the production. So you wouldn't want to buy something local that required more energy on the production side just to save a little bit of energy on the transportation side. Tomatoes are an easy example. I can buy hothouse tomatoes in heated greenhouses here. I can ship tomatoes a long way, much more efficiently than I can heat a greenhouse. So there's trade-offs to be remembered. Some of the things this story will favor locally, some quite the reverse, and we've got to be careful not to be too simplistic. Much more important, I think, what do we really get with some of these strategies? Because all of these, strategic clusters, economic gardening, going local, we fund with public money, and I'm just encouraging you to ask, is it a good investment? What else could we get with that money? What other safety net issues are out there, safety net programs are out there that need help? But stepping back even farther, what's been bothering me is that we've developed something of a culture of no. If it's not small, I don't like it. If it's not high tech, I don't like it. If it's not green, and that presents problems for economic development. And I wanted to add into this title of my talk something about the BizProv. I don't know how many of you have the Improv Theater. A couple of the folks that are at the Improv Theater have started working, and they actually have a little routine that they can take to companies, and it's called BizProv. And how do you take some of the things that they use in improvisational theater into a business? And one of the main lessons from their program is how do you go from a culture of no, being very critical, to a culture of yes? And instead of having a business come and say, I want to start my business, I'm not particularly small or I'm not especially green, how do you still say yes? How do you create that culture of, we want your business, we want to make things work for you? More on that in a moment. I want to also speak about broad trends, but before I do, and several of you have seen these slides, and I apologize, but we did a project for the Northwest Economic Council last year, and some folks from Sustainable Connections, I think Derek's here, and Megan Thomas left, Center for Economic Vitality, the Chamber, and the city. A number of us conducted a survey and some follow-up interviews of businesses in the community, and we ought to take these results with I'd say a container, huge shaker of salt, not just a few grains. So we have small sample problems with this, and the way it was advertised, there's probably some biases in it, but I still think the results are quite helpful. So for those of you in the back, on the left side, first column, results are very important. Next column, important. Moving to the right, then not important, and the far right, not applicable. Okay, so this question, how important is access to recreation, not to you, but to your business? 46% of the respondents said, very important. I mean, notice, almost all the businesses are saying access to recreation is either important or very important to the success of my business. Okay. Proximity to family or friends, 52%. Not to your happiness, not to why you live here, but to the success of your business. Having a quality and a available workforce. Okay. 40% said important, but the same number said not applicable as very important. Can somebody explain this? close to, the question was how big was the sample? It's close to 400 respondents, but a lot of the questions only had about 250 answers. How big are businesses in Whatcom County? If you go out and talk to a business owner or manager, on average, how big will the business be? How many people do they employ? So this graphic shows the distribution of firms by the size of the firm. So the big spike is 1 to 4 employees. The categories on the far left, 0 employees, 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 19, and it gets bigger but doesn't really matter, does it? All the way out to 1,000 or more. That's the final category on the right. So before we talk too much about this, we have a quiz. I'm going to hit the button and I'm going to add Washington State and Skagit County. How different will it look? You can't see Skagit because it's right underneath Washington State. And I can add North Carolina and Indiana, and it doesn't change at all. Right, because for every Peace Health, or St. Joe's, whatever you want to call it these days, how many nail salons are there? How many gas stations are there? So this is what I would call an economic regularity because you see it in every single county in the United States. The graph looks just like this. Now, that means, because it's, in Indiana, by the way, it's a little bit tough. 56% of the businesses have 1 to 4 employees. It's 55 in North Carolina. It's only 55.2 in Washington State or something like that. Quite similar. But if you go out and randomly sample businesses, odds are they're going to have less than 5 employees. 60-something%. Basically, 2/3 of the businesses have less than 5 employees. So when you start doing a sample like this, that's who's going to be responding quite a bit. And I was doing a version of this to a Rotary group, and somebody said very wisely, I was one of the people that answered the survey. And you asked me how important was that workforce to my business, and I said, not important. I have a half-time helper. He said, you should have asked me how important is that workforce to the regional economy. And I thought, good point. Next time I get to do the survey. Now, where are the workers? This is number of firms. Think for a moment, there's 6,500 firms. Make it 7,000 to do the math easily. 3,500 of them have 1 to 4 employees. Where are the workers? So, the blue line is Whatcom County, and in short, we have 2 firms with over 1,000 employees, Western and St. Joe's, and they employ as many people as the 60% of the firms with fewer than 5 people. So I'm looking around at least one ex-city council member. Impossible. I have my finger on the pulse of business in Whatcom County. Well, what do you mean? I've talked to them. I know what they want. I have all the respect in the world because I would have no idea how to digest. Do I give the same vote to Hagen as the nail salon? I don't want to go there. That's one of the things I want to back up in terms of economic development policies. I don't want to have to make such decisions. I would never. I don't think I can make a good decision there. By the way, when you look at a graph like this, and I hear that big box stores are undermining local economies, and I know there's a story to be told because the way the landscape, especially the retail landscape, has changed over time with malls and so on and so forth. But the fact that this is so similar place to place makes me wonder. So here's a question. Here's one of my tangents that I'm not supposed to follow. I'm now off script and getting in trouble. To what extent is our angst about the changing landscape, again, especially retail, due as much to architecture as to the underlying economics. That a lot of these small, unique businesses are hidden away in really ugly strip malls. Don't know. Okay, so here's a different take. This is the same data I showed a moment ago about the workforce. But the bars I just added are as if I weight the responses that we got by revenue, by firm revenue. If I give a little bit more weight to the firms that have greater revenue, I get a very, very different picture. And this is part of what I'm saying. I would hate to be the elected official saying, I understand what's going on with business, because I'd have to start making, do I weight the responses by revenue, by size, by number of employees, by something else? And that's a slippery slope. This slide shows, and focus just on the blue bars for a moment. And it basically says 30% of our respondents found all of their customers from Whatcom County. So the sell local idea would be fine for them. 15% of the respondents didn't find any of their customers in Whatcom County. But when you look at the red bars, you get something very different. And there's a story to be told here, if we had time for a longer tangent, about the importance of the local business, but also a potential dependence of those local businesses on the money that comes in from some of these other firms and vice versa. So to me, it's an interdependent story. And then finally, here's just to illustrate. Look only for a moment at the very important, the three bars on the left. How different the implications are if we weight by revenue or employment or don't weight at all. So one is percent of respondents, but then it's weighted in different ways. And you can see how much it changes and how hard it is to try to figure out what's the business community telling me? What does the business community want? Okay. So enough of the background. Still thinking about strategic clusters or gardening. If I said you had to pick some clusters to focus on, pick some industry sectors, what would you pick? I used to say finance. Oh well. Bad idea. There are some jobs that we talk about as being appealing. Where are those jobs found? They're not equally distributed across the landscape. And there's some rules of thumb that I want to, especially about education, that I want to ask about. And you'll have to stop me from going off on a long tangent on productivity. But here's just to try to get you thinking about big picture. This graphic, the blue line shows basically the change in gross domestic product over time. So the bottom axis is quarters, essentially since the start of the recession. And then the green line shows employment since the start of the recession. And here's the problem, or the conundrum. We're now producing what we were at the start of the recession or before the recession with 6.5 million fewer workers. That's not an outsourcing story, that's a productivity story. Why? And what does it mean? Okay. So last year, The Economist magazine had a fun article, and this was the cover photo. And the title said, "Print me a Stradivarius." Are those of you in manufacturing using 3D printers? So imagine for a moment a printer. You have to go past your dot matrix printer at home. And think about a printer that actually does a three-dimensional layup of whatever it is that you have designed on the computer. You can do a toy and print it for your child to play with. And they actually printed a Stradivarius, and they say it sounded reasonably good. Right. Just imagine for a moment what innovation really means to manufacturing, in terms of productivity changes. This sort of innovation means the idea, the entire process of developing a product from testing and so on changes, because I can now print tin and try to sell it. I don't need a large manufacturing facility. I don't need to go searching for cheap labor. Part of what I'm trying to get you to think about is how economies are constantly evolving. And we tend to focus on a point in time and romanticize about the good old days. It's not how economic development works. And I keep thinking about this picture. The preceding article in this one, that some of you I've shown before, it had a table with some numbers, and it had 4 phones, an iPhone, the early Androids, and a BlackBerry. But the article was talking about the phone companies would send the phones to a company called iSupply. And the question to iSupply was, how long will it take somebody to make a knockoff of this phone, and what will they be able to sell it for? And the point of the article was these companies needed to know how long they had a little bit of power in the market, and how long before their product was essentially dead. $300 phones. The knockoffs were all going to sell in the $165 to $170 range. So a couple of questions for you. Why were we willing to pay $300 for something? Where was that value? Where did we get the value? Partly in design, partly in the marketing, partly in the apps and the convenience. And remember, the assembly of that phone, of the $165 to $170, assembly accounted for $6.50. So we think about a question I would have: what is manufacturing? What does it mean to make things? Where does value come from? And we have to think a little bit more clearly, I think, about what's happening in economies. And we have to think a little bit more carefully about where it's happening. So this graphic is also boring. The top line is the average wage per worker in Washington State. Excuse me, King County. The middle line is Washington State, and the red line is Whatcom County, from 1969 through 2009. We're going the wrong way. Now, let's look at basically Portland and Eugene instead of Seattle and Bellingham. Same picture. Same picture if I put up Phoenix and Flagstaff. Same picture if I put up Charlotte, North Carolina, and Nashville, North Carolina. Why? The top one is the urban center in all cases. So wage growth is favoring urban centers. Right. We can read a lot. We can read quite a bit about how the world is flat and distance no longer matters because I can telecommute. But the data so far say something quite different. The data suggest that people are congregating, people of certain skills and in certain occupations, and that's going to be a point, are congregating in urban areas, particular large metro areas. And I'll look to Bob Pritchett in the back for help on this one. There was one article that investments in IT, above and beyond just basic email and web interface, the returns on those investments are much higher in urban areas than rural areas. So there's something going on, and I'm trying to give you a picture of an urban-rural split. What's been happening to the labor force? I don't think I have any slides on this one, but what's been happening to the labor force in Whatcom County over the last year and a half? When people have lost their jobs in Whatcom County, they've left. Part of the reason our unemployment is still good in terms of the numbers is because a lot of the people that would otherwise have been unemployed and raised their unemployment rate left. I call it the North Dakota syndrome. That's why they always have such low unemployment in North Dakota. In part, people are leaving, and you can go to Penderay in Spokane. So the school superintendent of Spokane has been sort of amazed at the increased demand for K through 12 slots. People have simply moved from the rural areas because there's nothing to do in hopes of a better job in Spokane. Right? But it's important to me in terms of economic development, because if we start talking about what sort of jobs do we want? Oh, we want high-tech jobs. You know, we want some type of clean job in finance. Well, maybe not finance. Professional and technical services. Finance is unethical. So this graphic, the taller, I took the 7 highest paying sectors in King County. So basically the job areas where average wages were the highest. I cheated. Fishing was number 6, but I left fishing off. So information, think software publishing, management of companies, finance, professional and technical services, some of the consulting, manufacturing, wholesale and transport. And then I just said, well, what percentage of the jobs in King County are in those sectors, and what percentage of the jobs in Whatcom County are in those sectors? And that's what the bars show. So in all cases but manufacturing, not only do we have fewer just because we're a smaller economy, but on a relative job mix sort of framework, our economy isn't growing nearly as fast in these areas as the urban areas. The graph looks exactly the same if I ask what was the percentage increase in these sectors from, say, 2000 to 2010. You get much more growth in these sectors as well. So back to the cluster idea, back to the gardening idea, well, we're going to have to ask, what can we do where we're going to be successful? Because in some sense you're competing with King County or Vancouver, BC that is. Okay, one more. That was with lacking any type of smooth transition as you would find in literature. We're jumping to a graphic that I hope just reinforces what you already think. Better education, better chance of a job. So on the left for you, unemployment rate. The top to bottom. Doctoral degree is at the top, professional degree, master's degree, bachelor's, associate, some college, high school diploma, less than a high school diploma. So professional degree unemployment last year, 2.4%. Less than high school, 15%. And then on the right is some data on earnings. So nothing new there, right? All right, bear with me. Focus on the red line. Because on the bottom, it's a paper that talks about skill and employment. Again, the red line, because as I move left to right on the horizontal axis, I'm imagining greater skill. And going up the vertical axis, more employment. So you'd expect, or more gains in employment. So you'd expect almost a 45-degree line, just a straight line going up to be consistent with that story, correct? Okay. And the red line tells us that from 1980 to 1990. Now look at the blue line, more U-shaped. 1990 to 2005, what's going on? If I'm lucky, a couple of things that we've been talking about all come together. The graph suggests something about declines in employability or employment change for mid-skill workers. Here's a different paper, same topic. So high-skilled, so data from 1997 to 2006, high-skilled, and the papers suggest, think about this as high-skill, non-routine work. Significant increase in employment. Medium-skilled, and they said medium-skilled this is all white-collar work, by the way. But routine work, minus 30%. Partly an outsourcing story, but definitely a productivity story, because the jobs can be either, if not automated, they can be replaced or made unnecessary by increased productivity with other workers. low skill, non-routine, from administrative assistants to a number of different techs. Small increase, but positive. And there's your U shape from that line before. These are some things that I think we ought to be looking at when we think about local economic development. What are we training people for? Okay. Are we training people for jobs that are likely to be there or not? Are we training people for jobs that are likely to be here, or will they be in an urban center? And we've got to ponder those bigger trends. So I'll go back. I did not want to imply with my beginning that economic gardening is silly or going local is silly. I think there are really important sentiments and really important ideas in all of those strategies. My concern is that we push them too far. We think about them too myopically, and we get in trouble. We ignore the costs of those policies, and that we need to do a better job of looking at the broader trends. So I'm going to be suggesting that we embrace business, period. Not trying to guess right now what's going to be a growth business, what's going to be a high-wage business in the future. Not trying to guess which businesses are going to be replaced by technology and which ones won't. But one of the things that was really clear, I think, from the survey work we did and the interviews that we did, because it really didn't matter who we interviewed, and the interviews were people of all political stripes. There's definitely an interest in what I have up here is the value of natural capital, preservation of environmental amenities. So I'll talk about natural capital, human capital, and then financial or built capital. So before I put my main conclusion up, think for a second, if you will, about the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina and Silicon Valley in California. The Research Triangle Park was an idea because you had University of North Carolina, Duke, and North Carolina State all within 20 minutes of each other, and a bunch of pine trees in the middle. And the thought was, I don't really care whether I have faculty that are interested in startups, students that are interested in startups, larger businesses that want to come take advantage of the workers, the graduates, businesses that want to come take advantage of the faculty, whatever combination. Right. There's lots of stories about a bit of serendipity and a little bit of luck. When a large pharmaceutical company called from Europe looking for a place to start in North America, there happened to be a connection between somebody in North Carolina, and they just said, hey, have you looked at the Research Triangle Park? But again, the idea was not a culture of no. It was a culture of yes. We want to make any business successful. Our job is to find a way to make you fit. And there actually were some pretty strong interest in preserving, starting in the 50s, to preserve water resources and height restrictions. Interestingly enough. I'm not proposing anything, not stepping into that one. Silicon Valley, there was actually no stated interest in technology when it started. There was a debate. Stanford had a chip on its shoulder because there were a number of companies that would get their ideas at Stanford and then go back east. They would go to Boston, they would go to New York, they would go, and Stanford wanted to prove that businesses could be successful, that part of California was a good place to do business. Now, the fact that it was an engineering professor who was as passionate about this as anybody helped push some of the tech side, but it certainly wasn't built in. Both were cultures of yes, to steal that expression from the biz prof. So I wonder what would happen if we said our economic development strategy is really rather simple. It's high standards, high assistance. We'll say yes to you. We're going to have high standards, and I would really emphasize environmental standards and certain performance metrics, not, again, size of business, type of business, wages paid, and the like. offering assistance to meet those standards. And I don't think it would be a stretch to get here. We already have a number of agencies in place that could help companies meet standards rather than advocating for particular types of business. So it's just changing a little bit of the mission of existing organizations. So I put down at the bottom, have limited term, privately funded efforts to attract firms in key areas. If you want to have a recruitment program, do it. If you want to have a buy local campaign to celebrate local, do it. Have them sunsetted, have them privately funded. Doesn't seem to be too hard. And I think that's it. Careful, I have lots of slides behind the thing that said thank you, just in case for your question. So.
So Chuck's going to get the lights, and then Chuck Foster and Hal Thurston will be there at the microphones for members who wish to ask questions. Obviously, it's a lot of interesting and fascinating material, and I'm sure we have some questions.
Don't be shy.
Maybe not. Good, we can all get back to work.
Hi, Hart.
Hey, Alex.
So, to what degree does our proximity to BC and a huge population center in Vancouver provide any picture of economic future for Whatcom County? Is the border like a glass ceiling, or is there some permeability that we can perhaps use to take some of the ideas that you're putting up there and make them work here?
I mean, I think the most honest answer is we don't know. We don't have. Did you ever heard the question about, what's the role of Canada or the Canadian dollar today in the regional economy, and what does it mean to have that many people and that much anything that just a little bit north? And the reason I said I don't know is we have only anecdotal evidence about the role of the Canadian dollar. I can rattle off what Walmart or Costco or the markets up at Birch Bay have said about what percentage of their customers come from Canada, and we can take guesses from old surveys about what it means. Our retail sales have not grown much faster. They've grown a little bit faster than the state overall. So we typically conclude we get a little boost from Canadian shoppers, but it's not huge. Today we still have border crossings are up this year relative to the past several years, right? But we still have less than half of the people crossing the border coming south than we did in 1991. And on a population-weighted basis, right? Think how much Vancouver has grown in 2 decades, and the fact that we still have that many fewer people coming south suggests that there's a bit of a glass ceiling. And I would say that one question is how do you crack that? So I think there's a lot of potential, but some barriers.
Question in the back. Michael Stein.
Mike, can you yell?
Yeah, excuse me, try to yell. You showed that urban centers were experiencing
a particular advantage. The urban centers had a particular advantage. They have higher wage jobs, grow faster, or a greater percent of the economy. Is there something Bellingham can do, other than doubling or tripling in size, that can make it function more like an urban center? What aspect
of urbanness are actually the part that
generate that, and they can create that?
My response is I can think of a couple little things. I'm going to say broadly, I hope there are things we can do. I don't know whether to call Bellingham and Whatcom County urban or rural. We are not classically rural the way parts of Pend Oreille County are. And there's a number of articles about rural areas losing population, really struggling economically in ways that we can't imagine. Right? So on one level, I would put us more in the urban camp. But we're so small. And there are some examples of where we are succeeding like an urban area. BP is in the process of adding 100 workers. Heath Techna has added over 100. The engineers at those firms make almost the same here as they do in Seattle. And those are one of the few areas where from in terms of the occupation, not just the industry sector, we have a similar share of those workers as a percent of our total. So there are areas that I think we could celebrate, and I'd love to hear anybody else's ideas. Or Bob, maybe you could suggest: are there things that we can do to help any business, large, small, otherwise, add some of the workers. So I think being more open is also being more urban in some sense.
I think you suggested with both the Stanford Research Center and with the Triangle Park in North Carolina that perhaps one of the important factors is having a visionary who promotes clearly either a goal or some attribute of this project that makes it succeed, whereas other research parks may not have had that visionary. Could you comment?
Well, the part of the visionary story is patience. A lot of the groundwork for the Research Triangle Park was put in place in the mid-50s. I went to an event in 1976 where still, 20 years later, the only building was the hotel they had built 10 years earlier to try to stimulate activity. There was really a 30-year period from when the time they started before you could really say, look what we've got. So the visionary is, and the other part of the visionary was the extent to which the political officials, whether they were university presidents or governors or whatever, worked together. Not to create a particular cluster, not to make the Research Triangle Park a specific thing, but to try to help it grow in whatever way it was going to grow. And they picked the Research Triangle Park, Port of Wilmington. They picked a couple of areas and to do the same sort of, we're supportive, was the idea. They didn't know how it was going to evolve. They didn't know what businesses were going to succeed or fail. But so the visionary part was being, looking long term, being patient, getting broad support and keeping it for quite a while. I think a number of other areas have said, we want to create something just like the Research Triangle Park or Silicon Valley, and we want to do it in 10 years, and you can't be that prescriptive and you can't be that quick as a rule. So, I don't know if that is. So.
I thought the most thought-provoking slide one that showed how over a recent time our economy's returned to the level of productivity prior to the recession, but the number of workers employed was much less. And that brings up an interesting point. The purpose and role of a business is not to create jobs. It's to create value for the owners and the customers. Jobs are an input, like raw materials, to be minimized in order to create that value. So expecting businesses to create jobs is a little bit like expecting a hen to produce corn instead of eggs. It doesn't quite compute. So how do you get around that one in strengthening our local economy?
I think you said it. You have to focus on value, and the cry for jobs is very short term and quite understandable, but a bit political. Is that if that's fair? We can create jobs by banning machinery. I don't think that's necessarily a good approach, but so I think you have to be. I'm now in the gap between the academic economist and the practitioner. The academic says jobs are the result of a different pursuit, not an ends in themselves. And I think that you're making the point you're making. So I would ask us to back up and look at what is it that we're trying to create, instead of saying we want jobs. To what ends, or for what value that we're trying to create. So, but the economic development practitioner and the elected officials are under some pressure to do something right now. So.
Had regarding the importance of recreation to existing business owners in this area, and it appeared that it was saying that recreation or the environment wasn't as important to their business, but it was important to them as business owners. Can you just say a little bit more about that? And if there's anything indicating that touting recreation of the local environment would be a draw for business owners and their families, even, I'm thinking, come to Whatcom County for the recreation, and by the way, bring your business.
Yeah. No, I think the survey suggested an importance of recreation, and the interviews made it even more clear. I mean, I'm looking for, there's several people in the room that helped with the interviews, so I'm looking around, and Derek, if you can think of something. So a couple of things. Recreation was very important. An interview that I remember vividly, because it was one of the last ones, was Superfeet. And we asked, you're in the process of building a new headquarters. Why Ferndale? And recreation came up. I think to be a little bit more broad and cover more of the interviews and more of the results, it was clear that a number of businesses valued the urban-rural balance that we have. And so back to Mike's point, the trick is, how do you behave in some ways like a major urban area, attracting certain jobs while preserving the urban-rural balance that we have? It's appealing to a number of companies. When I was talking, I said across political stripes. I mean, the importance of natural capital is huge. If I can be that sort of succinct with it, to business, not just to. Yeah, I just think business values it. So, and I think that came out in the survey and everything. Yeah.
I think we were also talking a lot about the importance of culture and not just the environment. And so I think business owners were also very responsive to this and think it's a business benefit to have a community that's strong in the arts. It's an interesting place to be. So I want to emphasize the arts and the environment in that.
Yeah, Hart, one of the slides that kind of interested me because it's changed quite a bit was the one that said that they said quality of workforce was like way down. And that was existing Whatcom County employers, I take it. Now, I know that not too many years ago that as far as economic development nationally, that was the number one thing that businesses that were looking at relocating were interested. Do you think that's a result because we've done a good job of training our workforce and we have a well-trained workforce and employers are kind of taking that for granted? Or?
I haven't thought about it that way. There's a chance it's taken for granted a little bit, but mainly the way I was interpreting the results is that most of the businesses that were responding are these little teeny tiny businesses where access to workforce just isn't a big issue for them. Firms that want to move, it's still high. Large enough firms that would be on your radar for relocating or making a dent in the economy, they list a trained workforce, quality workforce is very important.
I have a question to both the economists and the business owners. In terms of adding value, you're talking about natural capitalism, you're talking about the human capitalism, and you're talking about all that. Is it possible to have a complete paradigm shift, adding value, not just the economic statements, but also have ethics statements, environmental statements, and education statements? In other words, I'm advocating for a quadruple bottom line, to have a good black, operating in the black-free economy, in the ethics, in the environment, and in education, so that we can be resilient, the jobs will happen, the profit can be made, we can have the happiness factor, and our recreation can be preserved. Is that possible?
I'd be happy to respond, but is there somebody else that wants to respond to that first? We're out of time. No, it's. I think truthfully, I think for most businesses that is the goal. Most people are in business not just to make money; they're in business to make a product that they're excited about, that they think the product adds value, makes the place better. Most want to do it in an ethical way. They have principles and standards, and most value the place. So I don't think there's an inherent conflict.
Okay, I think we have to stop. We have lots of questions left, and obviously, Hart, you have stimulated people to think about issues and maybe to agree or disagree or maybe a little of both. But anyway, let's thank Hart for his wonderful presentation today. Okay, I'm asking Hart to come up this way because we'd like to present him with a gift of Whatcom Places too, so he can relish some of the environment that's important for our businesses in this community. Thank you again, Hart.
Thanks, Don.
Okay. And thank you all for coming. Again, I appreciate your coming on behalf of the program committee and the board. Thanks for being here. We had a record year. Our average attendance is over 180 people for each of our meetings this year. And the program committee is working on a bunch of good programs for you in the coming year. So hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving holiday and have a wonderful time for the rest of the holiday season. Bye now.